Greetings and salutations, friends and gamers of all stripes. I'm GM Dave, your man behind the screen, and today we're going to broach a topic that's been on the minds of a good many recently. I'm speaking, of course, of the recent PDF pamphlet released by Monte Cooked Games, titled Consent in Gaming. But before we dive in, I want to clarify why I'm choosing to discuss this now, a couple of weeks after the document's release and well after the initial frenzy of responses and opinions. I didn't want to be part of that initial frenzy. Why? Because after reading it on the first day, I realized this document is a more complicated beast than most of the initial responses on either side would have you believe. So I waited, and over the course of the last couple of weeks I read through the entirety of the Consent in Gaming document no less than 4 times. I watched every response given across every other tabletop gaming channel I follow, as well as a couple from channels I don't follow. Responses ranged from gleaming praise to abject contempt, and everything in between. And the more I watched and read, the more I realized this is something I couldn't see myself approaching from the seat of my pants. I needed to be clear in my thoughts and my arguments, to be as well-reasoned and easily defined as possible. I needed to recognize exactly why my initial reading of the document raised so many red flags in my mind, so that I could relay them to you in a manner that left little question why I stand where I do. I took the time I'd originally sent to record to write instead. In order to make sure I kept my thoughts in check and made the video as clear and concise as possible, I needed to script. So I sat down and started writing the introduction you're listening to now. But that's enough preamble, I think. In this video, we're going to take an in-depth look at the Consent in Gaming PDF, starting with what I believe works, moving into what doesn't, and finally finishing off with why I think this document stands as more of a problem than a solution to the issue it wants to tackle. And although it goes without saying, or at least it should, please make sure that you've actually read the document before watching this video. I'll leave a link in the description below for you to pick it up and have a look. It's free, it's only 13 pages, including the cover and the now infamous checklist at the end, and many of the pages are only half text thanks to all the art assets. So if you haven't read it yet, please pause the video, do so now, and come back. For those who have, let's not waste any more time and move right into what I think Consent in Gaming gets right. Many of you who've read the document and watched my videos might have noticed, as I did, that a large portion of what it recommends falls in line with the types of suggestions I give when we deal with the topics of maintaining a healthy gaming group. In fact, when you get right down to it, about 70 to 75% of the document says many of the same things I have in that regard. So for those out there who've been led to believe the document is nothing but bad, it's really not. The portion that covers the kind of behavioral practices that would largely be considered good to keep at the gaming table does take up the majority of the document, covering points like players being able to bring up issues to their GMs and vice versa, recognizing mistakes and slip-ups can happen and that we should be mature and forgive those, understanding jokes are part of the experience and should be recognized as a levity they are, understanding that if a problem arises it should be handled with politeness, patience, and maturity, being mindful of the fact that everyone has differing opinions on what is and is not acceptable, and it's up to us to make it clear to our group where our lines are drawn. Recognizing that all uncomfortable topics reside on the spectrum, and figuring out where our boundaries lie can be tricky. And finally, recognizing that the game is just that. It's a game. It's a bit of social fun. It is not reality, and we shouldn't start pretending like it is. All of these points, except perhaps the final one, are points that I've made myself in one way or another over my time on this channel. Taken on their own, these are perfectly fine suggestions for players and GMs alike to keep in mind in order to enable them to maintain a fun gaming environment that everyone at the table is capable of enjoying. And if we're being honest here, for the majority of veterans involved in this hobby, these aren't things we're going to actively need to think about doing. They've become second nature to many of us, and will become second nature to many more as they gain more experience and start to recognize that most of us are in this just for one thing: a damn good time. Unfortunately, Consent in Gaming doesn't give these points on their own, and as such, we cannot take them in a vacuum. Through my multiple readings of the Consent in Gaming document, I found myself continually frustrated with it. So many times I read point after point that I found perfectly agreeable and acceptable, only to then get proverbially smacked in the face by a statement so contradictory to those points that I found myself befuddled at how the authors could get it so twisted. To highlight this, I'll be sharing some of the blurbs in the document that were used to act as examples or provide additional context to the guidelines given. The reason I'm highlighting these blurbs as opposed to the excerpt from the document's main body is twofold. One, the blurbs provide a good encapsulation of the messages the authors were trying to get across in the particular sections they appeared in. And two, the blurbs provide the clearest examples of the kinds of contradictions I'm talking about. So with that said, let's move on to the first important blurb in the document: important things about consent. As you can see on the screen, this blurb lists the short-form descriptions of the 9 core points authors Sean K. Reynolds and Shauna Germain wanted to make in this document. At first glance, most of them appear pretty tepid and sensible. However, closer inspection reveals that there's a lot of contradictions present in this section, especially when we dig into the full examples provided. Some points end up being redundant, others clash directly with one another, and many leave the door open for abuse by that unfortunate bundle of pricks out there who get more entertainment out of ruining people's games than they do playing in them. But let's elaborate by looking at each point on the list and see how they interact with each other. 1. You decide what's safe for you. This is a fair enough point, although I do question the necessity of making determinations of safety in regards to playing what is ostensibly a game of make-believe involving dice. That aside, there isn't anything overly objectionable here or in the expanded text, which reiterates that you're not obligated to be interested in or partake in an aspect of the game just because it's planned as part of the game, especially if the subject in question does cross a line for you. However, while I agree with the final note that the others in the group shouldn't try to pressure anyone to accepting things they aren't okay with, the suggested idea that they should never so much as ask them to try to see their side of things strikes me as foolish. How will you learn if compromise is at all possible, if persuasion itself is even off the table? 2. The default answer is no. This is where the document's goal is defined. As such, I'll read it verbatim to you now. Ideally, consent starts with opting into things you want to try. That's the goal of preemptive tools like consent checklists. But it's inevitable that sometimes it also involves opting out of things you want to avoid. Of course, there are people who purposefully disrespect or ignore someone's choices, but more likely someone at the table will add something to the game that is unexpectedly difficult. It's always okay to say no after something is introduced, even if it wasn't talked about ahead of time. This is probably the most reasonable portion of the document. In fact, reading and hearing it, I'm sure many of you had it cross your minds how similar this sounds to the standard of what occurs in a Session 0. I also appreciate that they take the time to note that while there are a few out there who do something like disrespect someone's choices intentionally, much more often it's going to be something unexpected or accidental, and it's okay to speak up and voice your distaste for that. Now, I personally would have appreciated an added caveat about making sure to be polite with your grievance. One will catch more flies with honey than vinegar, as it said, but that is a very minor gripe, all things considered. 3. It doesn't matter why consent was given. This is where we start to hit snags, though they're minor and have to do almost entirely with that core line. The segment itself lists a handful of possible examples, then ends with the specific reason doesn't matter. What's important is that the topic makes you uncomfortable and you don't want it to be part of your fun, recreational gaming time. This core sentiment is largely real. As mentioned previously, there are likely to be certain aspects of games that some people won't want to broach. The specifics of why aren't all that important so long as it's clear they have legitimate reasons. But that's why I don't like the idea of bluntly stating it doesn't matter why consent was given, because to an extent it does. To say otherwise invites the potential for abuse by those who would turn such ideas into cudgels to ruin the good times of others. Personally, I'd much rather a more clear approach be taken with the language, something like it's important to respect why and when consent isn't given. This gives room for the group to respectfully approach for an answer while still making it clear that if the person genuinely doesn't feel comfortable answering, that is okay and that the group can still move on. 4. Nobody has to explain why they're not consenting. This ties in pretty closely with the previous entry, and like that entry, it's technically true but has snags. The biggest one here is the idea that the other players aren't owed any explanation, period, as clarified by the last line of the section. If you were the one objecting to that topic, you don't have to volunteer that you don't want to talk about it. The default is that you don't have to and you're not going to talk about it. The problem with this as a default is that it immediately puts a barrier of distrust between any non-consenting player and the rest of their party. Remember, you're all there to share in that experience. So if something arises that does make a player feel uncomfortable, they shouldn't be driven to feel like no one else involved in that same game is allowed to know anything about it. This isn't to say they must explain. It's fully true they don't owe a full explanation of why certain aspects of the game might get to them. However, it is common courtesy to at least give the other players some clarification, even if it's as vague as this certain thing brings back some bad memories and I'd rather not deal with them right now. Trust at the gaming table is about give and take. A non-consenting player doesn't need to give detailed explanations of why they aren't consenting, but they should be courteous enough to at least give something. By having a don't talk about it hardline as your default, you immediately build a sense of distrust in your group. Worse still, this inflexible approach adds yet another door through which the less scrupulous among us can use these guidelines to grief the group. 5. There may not be a reason why they're not consenting. This is where we hit the major problems with this document. The following blurb goes on to explain that this is meant to be for people who can't put their feelings into words in this regard, be that because they don't know how or simply aren't comfortable with doing so. That in and of itself is perfectly acceptable, and as the document states, we're complex creatures with complex emotions. It's not always easy voicing the things that make us uncomfortable because they're not necessarily clear. Unfortunately, the key point doesn't read, they might not always know how to voice their feelings. It says, there might not be a reason why they're not consenting. This is the moment where every asshole out there has had all the doors swung open for them to ruin the fun of any group using this document. This painfully clumsy, poorly thought out paraphrasing of the expanded point gives free rein to anyone and everyone using this document and checklist to simply say, I don't need a clear reason, I'm just not okay with this, to any and every aspect of the game they personally don't like. The real shame, though, is how quickly this poor writing kills the core intent of this section. 6. There's a spectrum for each topic. This one's pretty cut and dry, touching on the idea that some people will be okay with diving into specifics on uncomfortable topics while others might prefer more veiled language or, as is often the case with most examples in this document, no inclusion of it at all. Ultimately, it rests on the final point that if a GM isn't clear how the group will feel about a topic, it's better to err on the side of caution for the time being, testing the waters gradually and/or asking about it later on. 7. It's not up for debate. We hit a double whammy here. Redundancy and more options to abuse the guidelines. The explanation dives back into the ideas shared by the third and fourth points, though this time its position hangs more heavily on the idea of other group members pushing back. It's also much more hardline in its approach, as it seems to throw out any pretext of goodwill from the group and assume they'll be attempting to get the non-consenting player to change their mind via bribes, arguments, being outvoted, etc. It's a real mess of a section that not only assumes the worst of other people at the table, but gives us the first glimpse into a more major problem we'll be discussing a bit later. 8. They can always change their mind about what they are or aren't consenting to. Coming off the back of a point that assumed ill intent, we move into what ends up actually being one of the stronger pieces of advice here. It's natural to expect that players can and will change their minds on these things over time, especially as they become more comfortable with the group. As this section notes, sometimes those players might change their minds on a subject more than once, adding the caveat that these situations mean the player probably wasn't as okay with the subject as they thought. Through my experiences, though, it tends to be the other way around, with players almost universally becoming more comfortable the more they get to know their group. Then they can gradually be introduced to things they weren't comfortable with before and, hopefully, begin exploring the game in new ways that bring even greater levels of engagement, depth, and fun to the table. Unfortunately, it's not all good news, as this point can't be taken in a vacuum. None of them can, as each one works off the others, which means that in the context of what came before, you guessed it, we have another potential avenue open for abuse by those disingenuous few who would rather use this resource to get their way, despite what it might cost the rest of the group. 9. Anyone is allowed to leave an uncomfortable situation at any time. At last, we come to the end of the core 9 points at the heart of this document, and it's a fair one because, as they say, anyone can leave at any time. Perfectly fair. Fortunately, not conducive to a fun environment. But I'm getting ahead of myself. What's the greater context they provide? Well, the core point is right at the start. Every person's feelings of comfort and safety are more important than participating in the game. Kind of hard to argue with that. Unfortunately, the more we delve through this section, it becomes clear this isn't being treated as a last resort like it should be. I've made arguments in favor of leaving the table before, make no mistake. I've done it many, many times in fact. However, the key difference is I always make it clear that leaving was the last resort. It's what you do if you can't reach any kind of reconciliation for the problems at hand. So how does the document approach this? Does it ask the player in question to talk with their group? No. Does it recommend pulling the GM aside to speak with them before finding an excuse to up and leave? No. Does it recommend the player consider whether they've attempted any communication with their group before reaching this point? No. Instead, it gives a list of excuses they can use to remove themselves from the table while reminding them they're under no obligation to explain anything to anyone, treating it as just another way to avoid something you don't want to do. And that's fair enough if the situation warrants it, but there's no effort made by this section to help players define whether or not their situation does warrant this response. No suggestion that they talk candidly with their fellow gamers, people who are in many cases their friends, to try and resolve the issues before it reaching this point, just bluntly suggesting they leave. It's a bitter way to end this, especially since the paraphrase point makes it clear that literally anyone could do this at any time for any reason. Recall, this doesn't exist in a vacuum either. All those other problem elements can be used to bolster this excuse, placing even more power in the hands of individuals who can use this to completely ruin the experience of another 4, 5, or more people at the gaming table. It's a damn shame, because no matter how I slice this, I see the suggestion being a game ender. At absolute best, it leaves the group with no recourse but to continue without the other player, one they presumably wanted to have them join in their fun. Thus, we begin to hear the document's death knell, and it is only the beginning, because while this segment made up the meat of the document, we still have a couple more blurbs on the checklist itself to get to, so let's not waste time. The next blurb we'll be looking at comes at the top of page 10, above the Using the Consent Checklist section. As you may have noticed, we're skipping up a couple blurbs to get to this one. Do not worry, this is intentional. We'll be going back to the first one you scrolled past soon. As for the second, it's simply a reminder to try and separate events, emotions, and in-character actions from the game from reality. By and large, an unnecessary reminder in my opinion. I personally have always found tabletop gamers to be among the absolute best when it comes to separating fiction from reality, but there's nothing inherently wrong with this reminder, so let's just move on. The passage in question, visible on the screen now, deals with the idea of the game group once again needing to make people feel safe. Not just comfortable, mind you. The document takes great strains to clarify that the table needs to be, quote, a safe space free of hassle, harassment, negativity, judgment, and unfriendly behavior in general, both in and out of the game. Now, before I take aim and go fully against this point, I do want to give credit where it's due and point out that the writers do try to clarify their meaning here a couple sentences later. Quote, no one should have to worry about real-life situations, drama, or intimidating or obnoxious behavior. But even with this attempt at clarifying their intent and meaning, this passage ultimately states that having things like hassle, harassment, negativity, judgment, or unfriendly behavior isn't acceptable, not even in-game. I guess we'd all better get ready to say goodbye to our big bads, those bands of brigands or pirates, the hobgoblin slavers we plan to add in, and, well, quite literally any enemy with intelligence above an angry animal. We don't want to include any of that dastardly unfriendly behavior. Okay, jokes aside, I'm fully aware this isn't at all what the writers intended here. But that's why this is such a fine example of how poorly thought out this entire document has been. To even think of suggesting that these sorts of behavior, the kinds of which antagonists in our games will almost always display in some manner to the PCs, is unacceptable in-game is just silly. It shines a bright spotlight on how the authors really didn't consider how they were wording a document that they intended to act as a guide for handling people's sensitive issues at the gaming table. It reeks of opaqueness and a lack of foresight. Next, we scroll down to the bottom of page 12, the last page before the checklist, where we will see the blurb featured on the screen now. This section touches on the issues of topics the player might find uncomfortable approaching. The examples include sex, violence, religion, strong emotions, revenge, discrimination, acceptance, romance, family, values, and principle. As you can see, these examples range wildly in their specificity. Sex, violence, religion, romance, and discrimination are all relatively cut and dry. At the very least, they're familiar enough in the context of the game that we get a general sense of what they mean by including these. The others, however, are incredibly vague, and as such, they're going to raise a lot of questions as to what their inclusion here means. For example, how exactly are we supposed to find acceptance in this regard? Is it lack of acceptance, or too much? Is it accepting bad things happen or being unwilling to accept that? The meaning is never made clear. But this isn't the core point of what I wanted to discuss here. Moving past the examples after we note the point that we may or may not want to explore such topics in groups where they might make us feel uncomfortable or awkward, we reach this. Quote, if someone in your group expresses beliefs that you find abhorrent and you can't find a way to easily resolve the issue in a friendly manner, that's not the right group for you. Or perhaps for them. Talk about coming out of left field. How did we move from a mix of vague but partly understood in-game concepts to worries about abhorrent beliefs? Well, as out of the blue as it seems, this actually is not the first time the document addresses something like this. Remember, we skipped an earlier blurb, one that we'll get to very soon. For now, as confused and concerned as I am at this turn, I'll at least give credit that they finally note that groups resolve issues in simple, friendly ways. It's just too bad they had to wait till the very end to get there. It's also too bad that any goodwill this garners is severely harmed by the fact that it isn't the first time the writers were attempting to tackle this supposed issue. We'll see exactly why this harm is done as we examine our last blurb. You can find it at the top of page 7, and I'd like to read it to you now. It's on the screen too, so feel free to read along and see if you can find where the problem in it lies. You have to be casual around the other people in your game group. If you have to always keep your guard up or always worry what someone else will say, it's really hard to have fun. You need the freedom to tell jokes and say silly things, because, of course, those things are a big part of RPGs. And at the same time, you have to feel that no one is going to say something that makes you feel uncomfortable. Let's pause to look at what's being said here. Quote, you have to feel that no one is going to say something that makes you feel uncomfortable. Given it's not really possible to control what people say, how do we do this? The only way we could come close is to only play with our friends, but even then you don't have a guarantee. Even a checklist like this one won't be a guarantee, as the document itself states in its 9 main points. But as clumsy as this point is, this is not the problem element. Let's continue. We need to be willing to recognize when someone just makes a mistake, just like we want them to be able to handle our own mistakes gracefully, but I'm referring to more than just a rare insensitive gaffe. Sometimes there will be someone in a group who just holds different beliefs than you, just like in any group of people in life. And just like in other aspects of our lives, some of those beliefs might be downright offensive or make you feel unsafe. And no RPG is worth that. Did you catch that? If not, let me read it again because this needs to be understood very clearly. Quote, sometimes there will be someone in a group who just holds different beliefs than you, just like any group of people in life. And just like in other aspects of our lives, some of those beliefs might be downright offensive or make you feel unsafe. And no RPG is worth that. It's here that I became unsure of what the intent of this document was. They state here, in no uncertain terms, that playing with people with different beliefs isn't worth it if they happen to offend us. I can see taking that line if, and only if, one's beliefs do make another feel legitimately unsafe. Why and how that would come up in a TTRPG, I'm not sure. Not once have I or anyone else I've gamed with run into this problem with the hobby. But to cut ties over feeling offended? Ridiculous. We all have agency at the table, should be encouraged to use that agency to talk out grievances we might have in our group. This is especially true when it comes to taking offense at something. To suggest that isn't worth our time, well, I can only describe that as childish. Perhaps short-sighted, but we'll get into the why of that after we examine the checklist. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the checklist itself as its contents have been discussed to death already, but we will tackle some of the issues I spotted with it, as well as some salient points raised by other tabletop creators in brief. Now, as you can see, I've placed the checklist on the screen for you all to read. Included in it are the header, a key for understanding the tricolored checkoff symbols used throughout, the 4 defined sections which are horror, relationships, social and cultural issues, and mental and physical health, a blank additional topics section, and lastly a space for GM clarifications. Each of the 4 defined sections features at least 3 blank areas for players to fill in with their own suggestions, with mental and physical health featuring 5. But more important are the elements they do include. These range from things that are pretty mundane across most TTRPGs like bugs, rats, spiders, racism in the context of fiction, such as dwarves and elves aging each other, romance, natural disasters, severe weather, paralysis and/or physical restraint, and police, to things that are potentially more intense like harm to children, sex, gore, racism that's reflective of the real world, pregnancy including miscarriage and abortion, and genocide, to inclusions that are downright bizarre like the wholly undefined specific cultural issues or, of all things, thirst. The problem with a checklist like this is that it's very difficult to define the specifics when your descriptions are usually limited to one word. Let's take blood as an example. If a player chooses hardline non-consent to blood, does that mean they don't want any descriptions of blood in their game? To borrow an example from the Complex Games Apologist, what if the game they're playing has a bleeding status, such as Pathfinder? Would their hardline non-consent mean the GM isn't even allowed to include that effect despite how common it is in the first edition of the game? Or how about the topic that's been the most commonly bandied around? Spiders. Say you're running a 5e game where you descend into the Underdark to fight the Drow. Well, the Drow worship a spider goddess. They keep spiders as pets, and they can be cursed to turn into the hideous Drow-spider hybrid, the Drider. Spiders are literally intrinsic to their culture, so what recourse would you and your group have if the player came to this table saying they really want to play in this game, but they want any and all mention of spiders and anything related to them removed? Well, you only have one recourse at that point, telling them they're not fit for your game. To once more borrow from the Complex Games Apologist, one of the most major problems with this checklist is that it wasn't written with any considerations of genre, and by extension, genre systems in mind. Games like Vampire the Masquerade make it clear that feeding for vampires is an experience of extreme elation, to the point that it is essentially sexually gratifying for them. If one were to use this checklist for Vampire, though, and certain elements like sex, romance, and even harm to children, and yes, do note there are vampire clans in Vampire the Masquerade that only feed on children, were selected as a hardline no good, that player would end up being excluded from playing that game. It simply wouldn't be possible to run the game with certain elements marked as hardline no's, because some of those elements are intrinsic to it. And Vampire is just one example. CGA gives a few more, and his video on the subject is one I highly recommend watching. I will link it in the description below for you to look at if you would like to. So what do you do when faced with this situation? Most GMs would say they tell the player no because the game clearly isn't for them, and at that point they need to find another group. But that's not always going to work, especially in the realm of public play. As it happens, multiple conventions have already stated that this document is going to become standard practice for any games run in their halls. Some have also stated that GMs are not allowed to refuse players because of things they selected on this list. If they do so, they can see themselves removed or possibly banned from the cons altogether. And with that, we begin to see where the most serious problem with this document lies. There is no doubt in my mind that this document's combination of confused and contradictory messaging alongside its ill-defined checklist will only serve to foster conflicts. Every problem we've looked at up to this point speaks loudly and clearly to a my way or the highway mentality, even if that mentality clashes directly with the good suggestions the document gives. Consented gaming, by its very design, foists an incredible amount of perceived power and influence to the individuals in any gaming group that use it seriously. The chosen language removes just about all accountability from anyone who wishes to see elements they dislike removed from any game. Discussing one's reasons for wanting something removed is discouraged. Trying to get one to see things from a different angle is discouraged. Even asking for the most minimal clarity on why they want something removed, discouraged. In short, it centralizes all the power needed to shape the course of a gaming group into the hands of whatever individual has the most demands to make. This is, in essence, small-scale authoritarianism. Here's the catch, though. In the majority of cases, all the power this document provides is completely false. Most groups won't stand for one or two of its members derailing a game to cater to their every whim, as this document can and will encourage. They may put up with it for a little while, but eventually the people who easily abuse tools like this will be on the receiving end of all the grief they put their groups through. The end result is easy to see. Either they will be removed, the people sick of dealing with them will leave, and the entire group may collapse as a result. Bear this in mind when you consider these scenarios, though. It's not always going to be someone abusing these tools out of malice. It's easy for us to get into the mindset that the only people who would abuse something like this are the assholes who would do it intentionally, but that's just not true. I guarantee you many of these instances will involve people who do struggle with legitimate issues that they don't want to deal with in their games simply pushing too hard. There will be stories we'll hear about gamers who maybe aren't quite so cued in, socially speaking, becoming too pushy with this document. We'll hear about the people who went through rough experiences being kicked out of groups because they started using this document like a cudgel, and much of the time it'll turn out they weren't necessarily aware they pushed so hard. Thing is, when those stories reach the light of day, we'll see a clear division arise between those who take the side of the person who was using the document and those who take the side of the group. Nuance will largely be ignored, infighting and arguments will sprout, and the hobby will be worse off than it was. We know this will happen because we've already seen it in the convention scene. We were given a glimpse of it in the wake of the equally vague and nebulous anti-harassment policies that became the norm in cons a couple years back. And since many of these cons have now stated this checklist will be enforced also, well, it's not difficult to see where things are going to end up unless we push back. But all of this raises a question. Why did the document turn out this way? Did Sean Reynolds and Shanna Germain do this intentionally? Were they trying to cause a rift in the hobby by tackling what they knew would be a hot-button issue for most people in today's socio-political climate? There are a great many people out there who would say yes, but I'm personally not convinced by their arguments. I've been thinking a lot lately about Hanlon's razor. For those who don't know what that is, Hanlon razor is a saying that goes as follows. Never attribute to malice that which can be adequately explained by stupidity. In simpler words, it means bad things aren't always the result of people with bad intent, but often because they didn't think their actions through. And you know what? I fully believe that applies here. With each subsequent reading of this document, it became more and more clear to me that Sean Reynolds and Shanna Germain weren't looking at this problem clearly. I think they saw an issue that exists within the hobby. I think red flags were raised in their minds that they grew very concerned with this particular issue. However, instead of taking the time to dig deeper to see if they could find out how prevalent it was or what impacts the give and take dynamics of gaming groups have on this issue, they immediately set themselves to the task of fixing the perceived problem. The result is this clumsy mess of a document that, as we've seen, contradicts itself repeatedly in its attempt to curb this problem. And I think it turned out this way because they didn't fully understand the dynamic of tabletop gaming groups. Before you go waving your finger at me for making what might seem like a baseless assertion, I ask that you hear me out. As I've been planning out this video over the past couple of weeks, I learned that one of the two authors is very much an open and avowed member of the BDSM subculture. And I have to tell you, learning that cleared up a surprising amount of my confusion with the stances they took. Now, I want to clarify that I personally don't partake in the BDSM subculture. It's never done anything for me, and it probably never will. But that isn't true of all of my friends and acquaintances, and some years ago I learned, much to my surprise, that quite a few people I know were involved in BDSM to various degrees. Through them, I learned what some of the core rules behind the practice of BDSM are. Ideas like always looking out for the safety of the person being dominated, or making sure they always consent to what the dominator is going to do to them. Things like ensuring they are given time to readjust emotionally and mentally afterward to avoid the emotional bleed into their daily lives. Any of this sounding familiar? It should, because these are some of the exact suggestions given in Consent in Gaming. But here's the problem. Tabletop gaming isn't the same as BDSM. BDSM involves physical, sexual action. It involves pushing people's emotional limits and stands as an exercise in serious trust because of how the dominated can be physically, mentally, and emotionally at the mercy of the dominator. Tabletop RPGs, though? They're games of make-believe that involve dice, cards, and the spoken word. They're groups of people coming together to tell jokes and take characters they've made up in their head and quantified on a piece of paper through an imaginary adventure that doesn't exist in reality. In short, it's a creature that isn't even in the same state as BDSM, much less the same ballpark. And yet, because of that slightest bit of overlap involving consent, Sean Reynolds and Shanna Germain approach tabletop gaming the same way one might BDSM. They failed to understand what they were actually talking about, and as such, created this disaster of a document. Before I close out the video, I want to tie this whole thing up with a little anecdote that I had some direct involvement in recently. As some of you may know from prior videos, a few months ago I traveled up north to visit some good friends of mine. The goal, of course, was to spend the week gaming, drinking, and just plain having a good time. During my stay up there, I got the opportunity to meet their neighbor, a 15-year-old high schooler with autism. For the sake of preserving his identity, we're going to call him Jack. Now, when I met Jack, he was a pretty well put together kid. He definitely had some of the telltale signs of autism, most notably in his stature and the way he spoke. When he came by and met me for the first time, he greeted me without hesitation and treated me like I was just another one of the guys. In other words, if not for those couple key signs, you probably wouldn't even know Jack had autism at all. Thing is, Jack wasn't always like that. When my friends first invited him over, appropriately enough to play D&D, he struggled. He had no sense of how to interact socially with people, practiced very poor hygiene, had a bad tendency to drool and let his nose run without cleaning it, and frequently showcased panicked verbal tics. As a result, he was picked on mercilessly by other kids at his school, a situation made only worse by the fact that the area they live in is a pretty rough one, with lots of gang activity. Couple this with the fact that Jack's dad wanted nothing to do with him behind the collection of state support, and his mom and stepdad, loving as they were, ended up failing to provide him with the kind of structure support he needed to avoid these sort of problems, and it became clear very quickly that life was getting pretty rough for him. One thing you should know about my friends is this. They don't care who you are, what you've done, or what issues you might have. They're going to treat you the same as they would anyone else they're letting in with them. The same naturally held true for Jack, and they made it clear to him from the very start they'd be cracking jokes about him, and in the words of one of them, "We're going to talk shit to you like our mom talked shit to us so you can learn how to do better." Basically, it's the kind of stuff that would undoubtedly get many other Californians furious if they saw it happening to an autistic kid. But here's the thing. Jack thrived off that. He'd never had someone just treat him like another one of the guys before. He'd never had someone tell jokes about him in a manner that wasn't malicious. Never had someone encourage him to clean himself up while backing it up with stern support. He'd never been treated actively as just a regular person, and that included his treatment in the realm of D&D. My friends pulled no punches with him. They let him experience the game as he wanted, but his decisions in the game had consequences for his character, a concept he took to very quickly. Before long, Jack was a regular member in their group, and had even been asked to run a game for them. The Jack I met was a world apart from the kid my friends were telling me about, to the point that if it were anyone else telling me this, I'd have a hard time believing them. But I've known these guys for going on 15 years. I know intimately what kind of people they are, and because of that, I know there's no way they were lying about this. Hell, it's not even the first time I've seen them do this for someone with mental or social issues. Now let me ask you something. If the rules in this document were the norm for my friends, do you think someone like Jack would have made the kind of turnaround he did? Personally, I don't think so. And that's the biggest issue I have with this document. It assumes people with these struggles can't deal with other people treating them as they would anyone else. That's simply not true, but they're never going to realize that if they never get exposed to it. And when it comes to safe places to do so, well, you'd be hard-pressed to find someplace safer than the realm of quantified make-believe that is tabletop gaming. And with that, friends and gamers, we end our look at the infamous and divisive consent in gaming document. I know there are going to be a lot of strong opinions on this one, but I hope I've been able to give you a clear insight as to why my stance is what it is. And as for the usual closing ramble at the end, I don't think I'm going to bother with it this time. Instead, I'd like to ask you to all go out there, game your hearts out, and try pushing your boundaries a little bit. You might be surprised at how much fun that can actually be.